One of Hans Blumenberg's key insights in his work, The Legitimacy of the Modern Age, is that the theses of secularization developed by people like Karl Lwith, Carl Schmitt, and others, namely that some fundamental modern concepts and structures are secular reincarnations of theological categories, are not only exercises in conceptual genealogy, but are rather evaluative. That is, they are attacks on the legitimacy of the modern age. And what I want to do today in this paper is to claim that the bond between secularization and de-legitimacy is present not only in debates over grand historical narratives about the status of modernity, but is also present in the appraisal of specific modern philosophical programs. And what I want to do today is to show how the category of secularization is used to delegitimize Martin Heidegger's philosophy from both theological and secular perspectives by two of his former students, Jonas and Karl Lwith. And I will show that both Jonas and Löwith claim that Heidegger's conceptuality is full of secularized Christian concepts. And they both believe that the fact of this secularization discredits Heidegger's philosophy, but they do so even while their understanding of the process of secularization differs dramatically. And I'll do this basically by looking at two lectures, or two papers. One by Löwith, his comparison between Rosenzweig and Heidegger, and one by Jonas, the lecture Heidegger and Theology. So Karl Lwith was a former student of Heidegger's. He's perhaps best known for authoring a number of landmark works in the history of philosophy, and he played a very important role in Heidegger's 20th century reception. Today, I'm going to talk about his comparative study, M. Heidegger and F. Rosenzweig, or Temporality and Eternity from 1942. This is one of the earliest and most knowledgeable analyses of Heidegger's philosophy published in English. And it's a touchstone work for what is a proliferation of comparative studies on Heidegger and Rosenzweig in recent years. Now I'm going to focus on Löwith's interpretation of Heidegger and bracket the Rosenzweig aspect of that paper. And I'll do that because for me, it's important because Löwith approaches Heidegger through the lens of secularization. So in this study, Löwith sets out to show that while there are some parallels or analogous moments between Heidegger and Rosenzweig, a close examination reveals that they are in fact profoundly different. And the key distinguishing factor for Löwith is that Heidegger's philosophy is one of radical immanence and temporality, and Rosenzweig's begins with temporal existence, but it is ultimately geared towards transcendence and eternity. Now, throughout the contrast, Löwith repeatedly interprets central aspects of Sein und Zeit, Heidegger's main philosophical work, as secularized Christian concepts. So he claims, for example, that Heidegger reconceives divine revelation as aletheia, his key concept in Heidegger's philosophy, and he renders divine revelation as an immanent event related to being. And as such, Heidegger, and this is a quote, empties the concept of revelation of its theological sense, end quote. Other examples of secularized Christian concepts are Heidegger's distinction between authentic and inauthentic existence, which Löwith claims is a secularization of the Christian distinction between redeemed and sinful existence. And there are other concepts that Löwith mentions, Heideggerian concepts such as death, guilt, conscience, and others. These are all concepts that operate in Heidegger's ontological analysis of human existence, of Dasein, but Löwith claims that they are they originate in Christian theology and are secularized in Heidegger's non-theological context of his philosophy. Löwith writes that there is, and this is again a quote, an eradication of these concepts from their Christian sphere of origin, but on this very account, they are still related to it. Okay, so Löwith likewise claims that the fact that Heidegger lacks a notion of nature or cosmos in his work, a notion that was central to the ancient Greeks, reflects as well the stamp of Christianity and the alienation that human beings started experiencing from nature that emerged with the advent of Christianity. He makes a similar claim with respect to Heidegger's idea of authentic being towards death. So Löwith asks, why does Heidegger propose to own up to one's future possibilities in light of one's death as the path for authenticity, rather than simply putting an end to human existence being, that is suicide? So Löwith's answer is rooted in the history of concepts. He claims that the enduring mark of Christianity, in which suicide is forbidden and seen as a revolt against the creator, prevents Heidegger from seriously entertaining and let alone endorsing what was in the pagan world of the Stoics a legitimate response to the burden of existence, which is suicide. So while the idea of resolutely, authentically taking over one's possibilities in Heidegger reflects, I quote, a fundamentally anti-Christian and altogether irreligious purport of Heidegger's existential concepts, Löwith writes, because it lacks any dependence on the divine, or it doesn't involve any being towards or being with God. But Heidegger implicitly dismisses the pagan freedom for voluntary death and reaffirms in a non-religious register the Christian prohibition against suicide. So for Löwith, while seemingly operating in a secular, non-Christian work, Heidegger's formal and ontologized concepts are dependent on Christian origins and preserve something of them. So Heidegger's conceptuality is at once anti-Christian and at the same time unsuccessful in detaching itself from its Christian roots. Now, this is a line that Löwith repeats in many works he writes on Heidegger. Heidegger's philosophy is not simply secular, it's secularized. The origin of its categories are Christian, and although they're stripped of their original meaning and context, they still bear a Christian stamp that endures also after and by means of their secularization. So Heidegger seeks to overcome and dispose of the Christian conceptual world, but he remains entangled in and determined by it. Now, this understanding of Heidegger as a secularized, godless Christian thinker is in line with Löwith's general understanding of the secularized character of key strands of modern thought more generally. The most famous place where he outlines this is in his 1949 work, Meaning in History, where he argues that modern secular philosophies of history perceive themselves as independent of or even countering the biblical redemptive history, but they are in fact indebted to this theological narrative and are in continuity with it. So like with Heidegger, Löwith judges that the modern historical consciousness is, I quote, as Christian by derivation as it is non-Christian by consequence. So secularization for Löwith is a concept of hybridity and dishonesty. He claims that the modern man has not made up his mind whether he is Christian or pagan. He calls Heidegger a godless theologian, or a theologian by tradition and an atheist as a scholar. So as such, Heidegger's philosophy is fundamentally incoherent. And Löwith believed that as an alternative, the most desirable path forward for a genuinely post-Christian world is not following Heidegger, but a certain return to the pagan view of a cyclical history rather than a linear, and amor fati that finds its quintessential expression in the Stoics, and this naive pagan conception of a cosmos or physis that encompasses both the world and the human being. He also seeks to retrieve the pagan legitimacy and dignity of suicide in Löwith's constructive work. So just to conclude this section, for Löwith, Heidegger's philosophy is certainly non-Christian, but it is non-Christian in a secularized manner. And as such, it's, according to Löwith's understanding of secularization, it continues the Christian legacy, and as such is incompatible with paganism, which is Löwith's desired alternative. Now, somewhat of a mirror image of this view can be found in Hans Jonas's account of the secularized nature of Heidegger's philosophy, which he expresses in his 1964 lecture titled Heidegger and Theology, which he delivered in Drew University in the US. Now, this lecture is an important moment in Heidegger's reception history in the US. I'm not going to say too much about it, but it was, I think, correctly described as a coup. Jonas was invited to substitute Heidegger, who was supposed to give the lecture, but then couldn't leave Germany because of health issues. It was intended to be a celebration of Heidegger's thought and its possibilities for Christian theology, but Jonas's lecture ended up being a devastating critique of Heidegger and a warning against utilizing it for Christian purposes. Now, scholarship on this lecture has commonly focused on Jonas's views in this lecture with respect to his earlier analysis of Heidegger and Gnosticism. And in this lecture, in this paper right now, I don't want to focus just on this lecture and try to understand the inner workings of its argument. So this Jonas's lecture came as a response to a surge in Christian interest in Heidegger during the 1950s and 60s in the US. And as a response, Jonas implored his audience that Heidegger's appeal to Christian thinkers could be likened to a Trojan horse. Its harmless appearance is deceptive, and drawing on it will result in the infiltration of dangerous ideas to Christian thought. Now, Jonas certainly identified and appreciated the theological appeal that Heidegger presented, as Jonas claimed. Many Heideggerian structures, concepts, and vocabulary bear a distinct Christian ring. And Jonas repeats many of the examples that Löwith, that are found in Löwith's essay that I just mentioned, including guilt, consciousness, the call, revelation, many Heideggerian concepts that have a Christian ring to them. But for Jonas, it's precisely on account of this appeal of affinity that he believed that Heidegger's philosophy was so dangerous. Heidegger's philosophy is not Christian allied, but a disguised pagan framework. It is pagan because it's confined to the totality of this world and lacks any recourse to a transcendent God beyond being. And given this radical immanence, any similarities or parallels between Heideggerian ideas and Christianity are delusionary, Jonas claims. But how should we understand these similarities? And Jonas's answer to this is straightforward, and I quote, his answer is the well-known and always known fact that there is much secularized Christianity in Heidegger's thought. So Jonas certified that Heidegger's secular thinking does embody elements of Christian thought, but that at the same time, it is incompatible with Christianity. So like for Löwith, the key to Jonas's objection to his former teacher in this lecture is understanding of secularization, but he understands the relationship between the original Christian elements and their de-theologized manifestation in Heidegger differently. For Löwith, for Jonas in this lecture, secularization means a stripping of the categories from their Christian content and relocating them into an immanent context, that is, making worldly what was previously in a context of unworldly. So there's a transformation of content that includes not only altering the category's original Christian content, but also eliminating it. So according to Jonas's understanding of secularization in this lecture, nothing of the original Christian content remains. And that's why Jonas concludes that Heidegger's philosophy is pagan, that is not only non-Christian, but anti-Christian. So secularization here is a specific kind of de-Christianization, one which results in a positive account, that is paganism. And for this reason, Jonas also claims that any attempt to reappropriate secularized Heideggerian concept back into a Christian theological account, which was what many theologians around him were doing, would lead to the penetration of pagan ideas into Christian theologies. So for Jonas, these categories have been de-Christianized, corrupted, and converted into pagan categories. And because of that, they cannot be re-Christianized. And therefore, a Heideggerian-inspired Christian theology is a self-defeating exercise. Now, there are many comparable elements in Jonas's and Löwith's interpretation of Heidegger. Most relevant for this paper is that both claim that Heidegger's philosophy cannot be properly understood without acknowledging its secularized character. And speaking of secularization, they're not referring to any sociological process, any Entzwauberung or privatization of religion, or any one of common understanding of secularization. For them, it refers to a process in the realm of ideas, the transition and transformation of concepts and structures from their origin in a religious framework to a supposedly or unsupposedly secular context. In this case, from Christianity to Heidegger's philosophy. They both claim that Heidegger's philosophy has many reworkings of originally Christian categories, but for both of them, this also is not simply a genealogical descriptive account of the origins of Heidegger's concepts, but interpreting his thought through the prism of secularization is evaluating it. That is, Heidegger's thought is different from what it seems, and revealing its Christian depths is intended to lay bare its true identity. And the category of secularization is key for doing that. And for both thinkers, the accusation of secularization is a form of de-legitimation. But this is basically where Jonas and Löwith part ways. This is because from Löwith's perspective, the secularized Christian legacy in Heidegger's thought makes it illegitimate because it reproduces and perpetuates the Christian charge or Christian elements in philosophy. For Jonas, however, the secularized elements in Heidegger's thought make it illegitimate because their pagan corruption makes them antithetical to authentic Christian faith. And now, naturally, Jonas's and Löwith's notion of legitimacy differs. For Jonas, legitimacy in this lecture is based on fidelity to tradition and upholding its purity, while for Löwith, it's based on novelty and coherence. So Jonas criticizes Heidegger's paganism from a Christian perspective, taking his audience's perspective. Jonas was not Christian, while Löwith criticizes Heidegger's enduring Christianity from the perspective of paganism. So Heidegger is repudiated in both cases, but for opposite reasons and from opposite perspectives. Jonas wished to expose Heidegger's paganism and his incompatibility with Christianity, while Löwith wished to expose his compatibility with Christianity and his distance from paganism. Now, there's also naturally a difference here in their understanding of secularization. One can sense a Hegelian flavor in Löwith's understanding of secularization. For him, it's kind of a Aufhebung. There's a dialectic of negation, retention, and carrying forward. The original Christian content is negated, but also preserved and carried forth in its new secularized form. And this dialectic means that Heidegger failed to liberate himself from the determinations of his Christian past. So there's too much of the original Christian origin survives the process of secularization for it to be considered new or non-Christian in any meaningful way. So for Löwith, there's a dualistic logic of continuity and discontinuity. Either a theoretical system entirely overcomes the conditioning of Christianity, or it remains tainted by it. The idea of a relative new beginning is ruled out for Löwith. For Jonas, it's a different understanding of secularization. There's no hidden content or presence, Christian presence, in Heidegger's secularized theorizing. I'm running out of time, so I'll just say that for Jonas, secularization could be likened to trauma. So the transformation of content involves no preservation and carried forward, but reduction, negation, and replacement. And Jonas believes that insofar as Heidegger's secularized concepts become pagan, they cannot be reinserted into Christian theology because they've been traumatized, as it were. They cannot be returned untouched or unchanged to their original position. Now I'm running out of time, so I'll just say that one thing that is worth reflecting on is the operation of paganism in both of their ideas. Both two different ways of dealing with Heidegger's philosophy and with secularization in thought, and the role of paganism, or the post-Christian construction of paganism, is something that's worth continuing to pursue, but that's a topic for a different talk. Thank you.